Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. There is a certain peace to be found in the untamed wilderness, a quiet isolation that draws us away from the blinding lights and heavy noise of the modern world. But what happens when that isolation becomes a trap? What happens when the natural world around you suddenly warps into something unrecognizable, predatory, and impossible to escape? Tonight, we travel deep into the ancient, sprawling forests of the Great Smoky Mountains to uncover a chilling event that defied the laws of nature and broke the minds of those who lived to tell the tale. Before we step into the fog, please do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment down below sharing your own strange wilderness encounters. Your support keeps our campfire burning and the darkness at bay. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The night the woods went completely silent, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a place of ancient, sprawling beauty. Spanning the border between North Carolina and Tennessee, it is a dense, heavily forested mountain range that looks exactly as it did thousands of years ago. It is famous for its rolling, blue-tinted mists that hang over the peaks and valleys, a natural phenomenon created by the vegetation exhaling volatile organic compounds. For millions of visitors every single year, this mist is a beautiful, serene backdrop for photographs and peaceful hikes. It is expected. It is normal. But what happened on the night of October 23rd, 1982 was not normal. It was not a natural mist. It was an atmospheric anomaly that defied every known law of meteorology, physics, and logic. It was an event that would leave 5 experienced backpackers profoundly traumatized, their equipment inexplicably destroyed, and the park rangers who investigated the aftermath utterly baffled. This is the story of a suffocating, predatory fog, the terrifying isolation it brought, and the desperate survival of 5 people who watched the natural world turn entirely inside out. To understand the sheer terror of that night, you have to understand the people involved. They were not novices. They were not unprepared tourists who wandered off a paved trail in flip-flops. This was a highly competent group of 5 friends in their late 20s who'd been planning this specific backcountry expedition for over 6 months. The unofficial leader of the group was 28-year-old David Cook. David was a high school biology teacher in Knoxville, Tennessee, and a man who spent virtually all of his free time in the woods. He had hiked the Appalachian Trail in his early 20s and knew the topography of the Smokies like the back of his hand. Accompanying him was his fiancée, 26-year-old Eleanor Wilson. Eleanor was an emergency room nurse, a pragmatic and incredibly level-headed woman who always carried a heavily modified, professional-grade first aid kit on their trips. With them were 2 siblings, Mark Bailey, 27, and his younger sister Julianne Bailey, 24. Mark was a structural engineer, a physically imposing guy who treated hiking as an endurance sport. He loved pushing himself to the absolute limit. Julianne, on the other hand, was a freelance nature photographer. She carried almost 20 pounds of heavy manual camera equipment, lenses, and tripods in her pack. She was there for the beauty, the still moments, the wildlife. The 5th and final member of the group was 27-year-old Thomas Bennett. Thomas was Mark's coworker and the least experienced of the bunch. While he was athletic and fit, he had only been on a handful of overnight camping trips. However, under David and Mark's guidance, he was well equipped, strictly following their packing lists and instructions. Their plan was ambitious, but entirely manageable for a group of their caliber. On the morning of October 21st, 1982, they parked their 2 vehicles at a remote trailhead on the North Carolina side of the park. Their itinerary was a grueling 4-day, 3-night loop deep into the backcountry, far away from the popular, crowded tourist spots like Clingman's Dome or Cades Cove. They were aiming for an unofficial, highly secluded clearing known to locals as Blackwood Ridge. It was an arduous 14-mile hike over rough, poorly maintained trails involving steep ascents and treacherous creek crossings. The first 2 days of the hike were physically punishing but completely uneventful. The weather was unusually perfect for late October. The skies were brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was crisp and biting in the mornings, and the autumn foliage was exploding in vibrant shades of red, orange, and gold. They made excellent time. David navigated flawlessly. Mark carried the bulk of the heavier communal gear without complaint. Eleanor kept everyone hydrated and blister-free. Thomas held his own despite the exhausting inclines. And Julianne snapped roll after roll of film, capturing the pristine isolation of the deep woods. By the late afternoon of October 23, 1982, they finally reached Blackwood Ridge. The area was a wide, relatively flat plateau surrounded by towering, centuries-old eastern hemlocks and red spruces. The tree canopy was incredibly dense, but the clearing itself was large enough to accommodate their camp comfortably. They immediately set to work. Because the ground was rocky and uneven, they could not pitch one large communal tent. Instead, they had brought 5 separate, individual, low-profile bivvy tents. Small, lightweight, durable nylon shelters designed to withstand heavy rain and high winds. They pitched these 5 tents in a loose circle around a pre-existing stone fire ring with about 15 to 20 feet of space between each tent. As the sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, casting long, dark shadows across the ridge, the group settled into their evening routine. They gathered firewood, filtered drinking water from a nearby trickle of a stream, and cooked their freeze-dried meals over small backpacking stoves. The mood was triumphant. They had conquered the hardest part of the trail. The next day would be a leisurely hike back down toward the lower elevations. But as the twilight deepened into absolute pitch black night, the atmosphere in the clearing began to shift. It started with the temperature. In late October, the Smokies can get cold at night, typically dropping into the low 40s or upper 30s. But around 8 o'clock that evening, the temperature plummeted with a terrifying, unnatural speed. Eleanor, ever observant, noted later that it felt like someone had opened the door to an industrial freezer. Within the span of perhaps 20 minutes, the air went from a brisk autumn chill to a biting, bone-deep, freezing cold. Their breath plumed in thick white clouds before their faces. Then came the silence. If you have ever spent a night in the deep woods, you know that it is rarely actually quiet. There's always a symphony of background noise. The wind rustling through the upper canopy, the chirping of crickets, the call of an owl, the scuttling of small rodents in the dry leaves. But as the temperature dropped, all of these sounds ceased completely. It was an abrupt, sheer drop into total acoustic deadness. It was not just quiet, it was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Mark made a joke about the wildlife going to sleep early, but his voice sounded muffled, as if he were speaking into a heavy blanket. The sound didn't carry. It just died in the air right in front of him. David, the experienced outdoorsman, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He looked around the clearing. The campfire they had built was burning, but the flames looked strangely subdued, as if they were struggling to consume the oxygen. He told the group that a severe, unseasonable weather front must be moving in rapidly, likely a freak pressure drop, and that they should all secure their gear, double-check their tent stakes, and get into their sleeping bags to stay warm. By 9:30, all 5 campers were in their individual tents, zipped into their sub-zero rated sleeping bags. For the next 2 hours, they lay in the dark, separated by thin layers of nylon, listening to the agonizing silence of the mountain. Julianne later reported that she couldn't even hear the wind. The air outside was perfectly, terribly still. And then, at exactly 11:45 p.m., on the night of October 23rd, 1982, the fog arrived. It did not roll in from the valley. It did not drift down from the peaks. According to the combined testimonies of all 5 survivors, the fog seemed to simply manifest out of the ground and the air itself, instantly and everywhere all at once. David was still awake, staring up at the roof of his bivvy tent when he smelled it first. It was an acrid, sharp odor that burned the back of his throat. He later described it as the smell of burning copper mixed with the heavy scent of ozone you get right before a massive lightning strike. A second later, his tent, which had been pitch black, was illuminated by a sickly, pale, luminescent glow. He unzipped the mesh window of his tent and looked outside. What he saw defied comprehension. The entire clearing was swallowed in a mist so violently thick, so densely packed, that it looked like a solid physical object. It wasn't the gray, wispy fog of a mountain morning. It was a blinding, suffocating, milky white wall. It was glowing with a faint, sourceless phosphorescence. David immediately panicked. He yelled out, "Eleanor! Mark!" But his voice didn't go anywhere. The fog was so dense that it absorbed the sound waves entirely. He couldn't even hear his own shout echo off the nearby trees. The silence was absolute, deafening, and maddening. He reached for his heavy-duty flashlight and clicked it on, pointing it out the window. The beam of light hit the fog and stopped dead about 3 inches from the lens, reflecting blindingly back into his own eyes. The fog was completely impenetrable. In the tent next to his, Eleanor was experiencing the exact same terror. She had woken up feeling as though she couldn't breathe. The air inside her tent had grown heavy, thick, and metallic. She unzipped her sleeping bag and tried to sit up, but she felt a strange, physical resistance in the air, as if she were moving underwater. She grabbed her flashlight, turned it on, and realized that the unnatural white fog was actually seeping through the tightly woven nylon fabric of her tent. It was filling her small shelter, pooling on the floor like dry ice, swirling and glowing. She screamed for David, but she couldn't even hear herself scream. The sound was just sucked into the white void. Over the next 3 hours, from midnight until roughly 3 in the morning of October 24th, 1982, the 5 campers endured an isolated psychological hell. Because they could not see past their own hands, and because they could not hear each other, they each fought a solitary battle against whatever was happening on Blackwood Ridge. Thomas, the least experienced camper, was paralyzed with fear. He lay rigid in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide open, watching the glowing white mist fill his tent. He realized that the temperature, which had been freezing just hours earlier, was now rapidly climbing. The air became sweltering, humid, and intensely oppressive. He was sweating profusely, struggling to draw the thick, metallic air into his lungs. And then, Thomas saw the shadows. He was staring at the wall of his tent when the glowing white fog outside was suddenly broken by a massive, towering silhouette. It was standing just inches from the thin, nylon fabric of his shelter. Thomas couldn't make out any features, just a solid mass of absolute void-like blackness that stood in stark contrast to the glowing mist. It was easily 7 feet tall, unnaturally broad, and it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, looming over his tent. Thomas stopped breathing. He closed his eyes, praying it was a hallucination brought on by panic and lack of oxygen. But when he opened his eyes again, there were 2 of them. They were shifting slowly, gliding around the perimeter of his tent without making a single sound. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. Just absolute terrifying silence. Meanwhile, Julianne, the photographer, was relying on her instincts. When the fog had first seeped into her tent, she had grabbed her heavy camera out of its waterproof bag. In a desperate attempt to see what was outside, she pointed the lens toward the mesh window of her tent and hit the manual flash button. The blinding strobe of the flash illuminated the campsite for a fraction of a microsecond. But in that frozen moment of light, Julianne didn't see trees. She didn't see the other tents. She saw a wall of thick, writhing white smoke, and embedded within that smoke, she saw long, spindly, shadowy appendages reaching down from the canopy above. They looked like massive, distorted arms, composed entirely of negative space, probing the air, sweeping back and forth. The flash died, plunging her back into the glowing white, dark. She dropped her camera, curled into a tight ball, and began to weep silently, too terrified to make another sound. Mark, the engineer, was the only one who tried to fight back. When his tent filled with the suffocating, ozone-smelling fog, his immediate instinct was that they were caught in some sort of freak volcanic venting or a localized toxic gas release from the earth. He decided he needed to get to his sister, Julianne, whose tent was pitched about 20 feet to his right. He unzipped his bivvy, put on his boots, and stepped out into the clearing. It was the worst mistake he could have made. The moment Mark stepped out of his tent, he lost all sense of direction, up, down, left, or right. The glowing white fog was so thick he literally could not see his own boots when he looked down. He held his hands out in front of his face, and they were completely invisible. He took one step forward, intending to walk in a straight line toward Julianne's tent. He took a second step. On the third step, the oppressive heat instantly vanished, replaced by a blast of cold air so intense it felt like physical blades hitting his skin. He turned around to grab his tent to reorient himself. His hand met empty air. He dropped to his knees, sweeping his arms wildly across the rocky ground, trying to find the nylon fabric of his shelter. Nothing. He had taken 3 steps, and his tent was gone. The entire campsite was gone. He was floating in an endless, silent, glowing, white abyss. And then Mark felt the vibration. It wasn't a sound. It was a deep, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the solid rock beneath his knees and traveled up through his bones. It was a rhythmic, pulsing throb, thrum, thrum. With every pulse, the metallic smell of ozone grew stronger. So strong, it made his eyes water and his nose bleed. He huddled on the ground, covering his head with his arms, convinced he was going to die right there in the blinding white void. Back in her tent, Eleanor experienced the most aggressive encounter with the anomaly. She was sitting up, clutching her medical kit to her chest, watching the shadows glide past her tent walls. Suddenly, the deep vibrating hum that Mark was feeling outside began to shake her tent poles. The fabric of her bivvy began to stretch and warp. She watched in absolute horror as the nylon wall of her tent began to press inward, right toward her face. But it wasn't billowing like it would in the wind. It was being pushed. Something was pressing against the outside of the tent, stretching the incredibly tough nylon to its absolute breaking point. It looked like a massive, featureless hand pushing into the fabric. Eleanor pushed back against it with her medical kit. The moment she made contact, the nylon fabric simply gave way. It didn't tear. It didn't rip at the seams. According to Eleanor's later statements, the heavy-duty, reinforced nylon simply disintegrated. It dissolved into a fine, ash-like powder exactly where the shadow had pressed against it. A massive hole opened up in the side of her tent, and the thick, glowing white fog poured in like a physical wave of water, covering her completely. She squeezed her eyes shut, held her breath, and waited for whatever was outside to grab her. For hours, the 5 campers remained isolated in their own personal nightmares. They endured the blinding light, the absolute silence, the extreme temperature fluctuations, the overpowering smell of ozone, and the constant gliding presence of the massive shadowy figures that surrounded them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. At approximately 6:15 on the morning of October 24th, 1982, the sun crested the eastern peaks of the Smoky Mountains. As the first rays of natural dawnlight hit the upper canopy of Blackwood Ridge, the anomaly collapsed. David, still huddled in his tent, described it as if a massive vacuum cleaner had been turned on. The thick, viscous, glowing white fog didn't slowly burn off in the morning sun. It rapidly sucked back into the ground, retreating with a violent, rushing speed. The oppressive silence shattered instantly, replaced by the loud, normal sound of morning birds and wind in the trees. The overpowering smell of ozone vanished, replaced by the crisp scent of pine and morning dew. David unzipped his tent and practically fell out onto the dirt, gasping for fresh air. He scrambled to his feet, expecting to see his friends doing the same. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. The campsite looked like a war zone. Of the 5 meticulously pitched tents, only David's and Thomas's were fully intact. Eleanor's tent was mostly gone. The entire right side of the heavy nylon structure had been completely dissolved, the edges of the massive hole looking frayed and singed, as if melted by a powerful acid. Eleanor was curled in a fetal position inside her sleeping bag, covered in a fine layer of gray dust, shivering violently but miraculously unharmed. Julian's tent had been violently collapsed. The aluminum poles were snapped in half, and the fabric was shredded into long, ribbon-like strips. Julianne was sitting upright amidst the wreckage, clutching her camera to her chest, staring blankly straight ahead. She was in a state of profound clinical shock, completely unresponsive to David's voice. But the most terrifying sight was Mark. Mark was not in his tent. His tent was completely untouched, zipped perfectly shut. David frantically ran around the clearing, screaming Mark's name. After 5 agonizing minutes of searching, David found him. Mark was lying on his back at the very edge of the clearing, almost 40 feet away from where he had pitched his tent. He was completely covered in mud and pine needles, staring up at the sky with wide, unblinking eyes. When David reached him, he realized Mark was suffering from severe hypothermia. His skin was pale blue, and his core temperature had plummeted dangerously low. This made absolutely no sense. The overnight low, according to the morning air, had been a mild 45 degrees, nowhere near cold enough to induce that level of rapid, severe hypothermia in a grown man wearing winter gear. It took David and Eleanor, the nurse, over an hour to stabilize Mark and bring Julianne out of her catatonic state. Nobody spoke about what had happened during the night. The terror was too fresh, the reality of it too impossible to articulate. They knew they had to get off the mountain immediately. They abandoned almost all of their gear. They left the shredded tents, the cooking stoves, and the heavy packs sitting in the dirt. Eleanor packed only her medical kit, Julianne refused to let go of her camera, and David and Thomas supported Mark, who could barely walk. The 14-mile hike back down to the trailhead was a silent, grueling death march. They moved entirely on adrenaline and sheer terror. Every time the wind rustled the trees, every time a cloud passed over the sun and cast a shadow on the trail, they flinched, terrified that the white fog was returning. They didn't stop to eat. They barely stopped to drink. They just walked. It was nearly sunset on October 24th, 1982, when they finally stumbled out of the tree line and reached the gravel parking lot where their cars were parked. They drove straight to the nearest ranger station, located at the Oconaluftee Visitor Center on the North Carolina side of the park. When they burst through the doors of the visitor center, dirty, exhausted, and visibly traumatized, they were immediately met by Senior Ranger William Wilson and Ranger Sarah Higgins. The Rangers immediately initiated standard emergency protocols. They provided blankets, hot liquids, and called for an ambulance to check Mark and Julianne. But when Ranger Wilson sat down with David, Eleanor, and Thomas to get their statements regarding what had happened, the situation quickly moved from a standard rescue operation into something deeply disturbing. Ranger Wilson asked them to explain exactly what had attacked their campsite and destroyed their gear. He assumed they had been the victims of a rogue black bear, a violent storm cell, or perhaps a group of malicious vandals in the backcountry. Instead, David, speaking in a low, shaking voice, told him about the glowing fog. He told him about the smell of ozone, the absolute deadening silence, and the way the mist seemed to move with intent. Eleanor described the massive, featureless shadows that glided silently around the camp, and how the incredibly tough nylon of her tent had simply dissolved when she pushed back against the weight of the dark shape. Thomas, trembling, corroborated every detail, weeping as he described the massive silhouettes towering over his shelter. Ranger Wilson was a veteran of the Park Service. He had heard every tall tale, every exaggerated ghost story, and every panicked misinterpretation of nature that a tourist could conjure. But this was different. These were not naive teenagers looking for attention. These were experienced, rational adults, and they were displaying genuine, profound psychological trauma. Furthermore, their stories aligned perfectly in the most bizarre, impossible details. The smell of copper, the glowing white light, the sound-absorbing properties of the mist, and the physical degradation of the tents. Because the hikers had abandoned a significant amount of valuable gear, and because their property had been seemingly destroyed, the Park Service was obligated to send a team up to Blackwood Ridge to investigate the site and recover the equipment. On the morning of October 25th, 1982, a team of 4 rangers led by Ranger Wilson, hiked the 14 miles up to the secluded clearing. What they found in the official ranger logs, which were later obtained through public records requests by researchers decades later, only deepened the terrifying mystery of that night. When the rangers arrived at Blackwood Ridge, they found the campsite exactly as David had described. The expensive gear was scattered around the fire ring. But it was the condition of the tents that completely baffled the investigators. Ranger Wilson documented the damage extensively. Julianne's tent had its thick aluminum poles snapped, but they were not bent or buckled, as they would be from a falling tree branch or a heavy animal stepping on them. They were sheared clean through, straight across the metal, as if cut by industrial hydraulic shears. The nylon fabric of her tent was sliced into ribbons, but there were no claw marks, no frayed edges typical of an animal attack. The cuts were razor sharp, surgically precise. The investigation of Eleanor's tent was even more disturbing. As Eleanor had claimed, a massive section of the side wall was missing. Ranger Wilson noted in his official log that the edges of the hole were not torn. They were brittle, chalky, and crumbled into a fine gray powder when touched. A forensic analysis of the nylon later determined that the material had been subjected to intense, localized cellular breakdown, essentially disintegrating the molecular bonds of the fabric. The Park Service had no explanation for how this could occur in the middle of the wilderness without the presence of highly concentrated corrosive chemicals or extreme focused radiation, neither of which left any residual trace at the site. But the most chilling discovery the rangers made was the state of the clearing itself. The Smokies are teeming with life. The ground is always covered in insect activity, small animal tracks, and the signs of a thriving ecosystem. But within a 50-foot radius of the campers' fire ring, the exact perimeter where the glowing fog had reportedly settled the ground was entirely sterile. The rangers noted that every single blade of grass, every moss patch on the rocks, and every pine needle on the forest floor had been drained of color, turning a stark, ashen gray. Furthermore, when they dug into the soil to check for root damage, they found hundreds of dead earthworms and beetles lying just beneath the surface. Everything within that perfect 50-foot circle was dead. Outside of the circle, the forest was completely normal, vibrant, and alive. There were no tracks, no footprints of towering shadows, no signs of any physical entity approaching or leaving the campsite. Just a perfectly circular zone of complete ecological death, and the ruined, degraded gear of 5 traumatized hikers. The rangers packed out the gear and returned to the visitor center. The official report filed by Ranger Wilson was thoroughly inconclusive. It cited an unexplained meteorological event and severe catastrophic equipment failure due to unknown environmental factors. Privately, the rangers who saw the site admitted they had absolutely no rational explanation for the physical evidence left behind on Blackwood Ridge. Meteorologists who later reviewed the case completely dismissed the idea of a fog possessing the physical properties described by the campers. Fog cannot absorb sound to the point of absolute silence. Fog cannot glow in the dark without a light source. Fog cannot rapidly fluctuate temperatures from freezing to sweltering in a matter of feet. And fog certainly cannot disintegrate military-grade nylon or instantly kill the flora and fauna within a localized, perfect circle. Julianne Bailey, the photographer, eventually developed the rolls of film she had shot during the trip. The photos of the first 2 days were beautiful, crystal clear images of the autumn foliage. The final frame on her roll of film was the picture she had taken in a panic when the fog first arrived, the picture using the flash. When the photo was developed, it showed exactly what she had claimed. The frame was filled with a swirling, dense white mass that completely obscured the background. And reaching down from the top edge of the frame, cutting through the white mist, were 3 long, impossibly thin, shadowy appendages. They were blurred, indicating motion, but they were unmistakably present. They looked like massive, disjointed fingers reaching down toward the camera lens. The photograph was heavily scrutinized, but no photo expert could identify the shapes as trees, branches, or any known animal. It remained an unexplained artifact of that horrific night. The 5 campers never returned to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. David and Eleanor eventually married, but they stopped backpacking entirely, choosing to spend their vacations by the ocean. Mark Bailey struggled with severe insomnia and anxiety for years following the event. Unable to sleep, without a light on in his room, Thomas Bennett moved out of Tennessee entirely, relocating to a busy, brightly lit city, terrified of the quiet isolation of the woods. Julianne Bailey never picked up a camera again. To this day, the events of October 23rd, 1982, remain one of the most baffling and terrifying unexplained incidents in the history of the park system. The official records offer no answers, the scientific community dismisses it as a collective hysterical hallucination, and the woods themselves keep their secrets. But for the 5 people who survived the midnight fog of the Smokies, they know the truth. They know that on that specific night, they were swallowed by something unnatural, something silent, and something that watched them from the glowing white void. They know that they were lucky to escape with their lives, leaving behind nothing but shredded nylon and a terrifying, enduring mystery in the deep woods of Appalachia. What do you think truly happened to those 5 experienced hikers on that terrifying night of October 23rd, 1982? Was it a bizarre, localized tear in our reality, a geological anomaly, or something ancient and predatory that stalks the deep Appalachian wilderness? I want to hear your theories, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think was hiding in that glowing white void. If this trip to Blackwood Ridge sent a shiver down your spine, please hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries to help us keep bringing these dark secrets to light. Do you have a terrifying tale of your own? If you have any stories, creepy encounters, or unexplained events that you've experienced, you can send them directly to me at mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. I'm always looking for new mysteries to share with our community. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's episode. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Until next time, keep your flashlights close and stay safe out there.